Peru people are struggling in an increasingly disheveled world to see if they can bring about some kind of more useful order.
Hi, I'm Ian Bremmer, and welcome to the GZERO World Podcast, an audio version of what you can find on public television, where I analyze global topics, sit down with big guests, and make use of little puppets. This week I sit down with former Ambassador Tom Pickering, who served more than 4 decades as a top-level diplomat, an ambassador pretty much everywhere, and even led the congressional investigation into the 2011 Benghazi attacks. He's the right person to talk to at a time when America's role in the world is an open question. Let's get to it.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company. Imagine a bank without teller lines, where your banker knows your name and its most prized currency is extraordinary client service. Hear directly from First Republic's clients by visiting firstrepublic.com.
Ambassador Tom Pickering, Vice Chairman in Hills & Company, career diplomat. You've been ambassador everywhere. Do we still have career diplomats? Are there any left?
We do. There are some left.
There have been a lot of people leaving the State Department.
Look, the top level, if you had 15, 20, 25 years experience, most are gone, and that's a loss.
I have been told that morale at the State Department under Pompeo is improved. Is that true?
I think you have to say that morale under Tillerson could not have gotten any worse. So Pompeo gets credit. And I was in the Foreign Service beginning in 1959, and I've never known a year when people didn't say morale is as bad as it's ever been.
Really?
Yes, sir.
The beatings will continue until morale improves.
Beatings will continue even if morale does improve.
Mm-hmm. The foreign policy establishment in the United States, both on the left and the right of the political spectrum, has been fairly unified in their opposition to President Trump.
Yes. Mm-hmm.
Is there anything they're getting wrong?
I think the foreign policy establishment may be underestimating the value of strong pressure and leverage in something like Korea, DPRK. I was on the bandwagon when Fire and Fury was most redolent, and said Fire and Fury is simply splendid, but you have to have open a process to get something done, to use Fire and Fury as an objective. Otherwise, you end up either going to war or backing down. And that's not the choice of the world's largest country, which can pursue and indeed gain much by diplomacy.
Now, he did say when the North Koreans were developing their ICBMs that a missile that would be able to hit the continental United States was unacceptable. He has expressed the desire to move towards denuclearization. Are those not policies in your view?
Perfectly important. You can't expect to produce it all in one big go. And Kim Jong-un obviously wants us to pay the highest price for the smallest step. So as going in, you have to calibrate carefully what you give and what you get.
And that process has not happened.
No, I don't see it happening.
So let's go to something happening right now, Venezuela. Situation's been deteriorating disastrously so for the Venezuelan people for years now, but the crisis appears to be picking up with the Americans deciding to recognize opposition leader Guaido as the legitimate president. Many other countries around the world following our lead. First question, was that the correct thing for the Trump administration to do?
It's a very important and interesting question. I don't believe that Guaido would have taken necessarily the oath of office without having some sense that he was going to have international support. I think this was an important pushback against Maduro. The really interesting questions for me is Guaido the chosen successor capable of running Venezuela? Because we're very good at knocking people off, but not so good at bringing in successors who in one way or another can manage.
You mean Saddam Hussein?
course.
You mean Gaddafi?
Gaddafi. I mean, let's start with that list and go down. The second question is, does this become an international civil war like Syria? God forbid. We don't need that in this hemisphere. Is there something that can be done first and foremost to deal with the human crisis? Should we be putting food on the border and pushing it over? Should we be working with the NGO community? Should the Secretary General organize some kind of humanitarian effort that the others, all of us who care about Venezuela, should be engaged in? And secondly, is a negotiating table better than a military shootout? And if it is, should that be the next step? The Russians have said they favor that, clearly because I think they're worried about what clearly would be a military action in which they would be less capable than others.
They don't have the leverage that they have in
It's the
Syria.
deployment capacity and the long distances and perhaps the money. Putin isn't running his country's economy, and never has, in a way that tends to look out for big involvements, costly basis.
I mean, the Russians were able, with relatively limited cost, to get what they quote unquote wanted in Syria.
Yes, and maybe with a small deployment or whatever they're doing in Venezuela, a seat at the table. If they can influence Maduro to go under conditions and circumstances that they can live with in the future and that we can live with, more power to them. If we're going to end up with a stalemate in which we become the evacuator and not the negotiator, then we're in trouble.
If you're the United States and you see the Cubans providing significant intelligence support on the ground in Venezuela to this regime, is it necessarily linkage with U.S. policy towards Cuba?
No, and it shouldn't be, but it is now because U.S. policy has turned. But I go back and think of the resolution in Colombia, where interestingly enough, the U.S. and Cuba ended up on the side of a negotiated workout in which the government of Colombia, I think, honestly can claim credit for doing a tremendously important thing in their own interest.
With the negotiations with the FARC on the ground.
Exactly. And is that the way of the future? I've been thinking about this. I don't know, but I think those are all things to explore. One wants to, as a matter, I think, of intelligent prudence, explore the non-kinetic efforts before you have to go kinetic.
What do you think, when you look at the places that a misstep, a miscalculation, a mistake could lead to dire confrontation in the world today, of a similar sort? What are the things that worry you?
I worry about the Middle East. I think we need to be somehow moving toward President Trump's better deal with Iran, if there is one, because we have no deal with Iran between the United States and Iran. Happily, our European friends are doing their best to keep the deal alive. And guess what? We are sanctioning them economically because they're doing it.
The people don't worry about the arms race these days.
It's fascinating. The degree to which we did during the Cold War is matched by the degree to which we haven't in this period of time. Perhaps one was an exaggeration of the Cold War, although I doubt it after the Cuban Missile Crisis, but cleaning things up helped and the decline of the Soviet Union helped. But now we're in a position where seemingly the ability to say it's all over and it's gone away resolves itself around the fact that it's never coming back. And here you have Putin and Trump talking about nuclear weapons as if they were hand grenades.
What's the thing happening around the world right now that you're most pleased about diplomatically?
That's a fascinating question because it's kind of hard to find a good answer to that question, in all honesty. I, from time to time, look north. And while people have differences in Canada about Trudeau, the Canadians have done an interesting job still in showing a lot of us what a reasonable country working in careful conditions can do. Now, Mexico is a little different, but we don't live in a terrible hemisphere. And AMLO has been very interesting because AMLO in the campaign so far hasn't turned out to be AMLO in the presidency. We'll have to see where that goes. But there is a real opportunity between those two countries, and the undoing of NAFTA for the penny farthing increase in the capacity of the new agreement to do things I think was hardly worth the effort. I think that we all have to think about improving the trade posture, but threatening to blow it all up
So was it
as
not-
a way to get a 6% increase or
Go
something
back.
was
Was
not
it not worth the effort, or was it not worth the process? Because again, it's not as if there was so much time and effort in terms of the negotiation. It seems to me it was more that you had someone who was threatening to blow it up, and it's the worst deal ever. Because it did need modernization, right?
Of course it could. Any treaty can be modernized, and this one had that capacity. We got an agreement. The president was happy with it. It was a small value, but not necessarily zero.
Not zero.
But the amount of damage it did, both in Canada and Mexico and then beyond, believing that living next to a whirling dervish is not a good idea.
But they can't move.
It can move.
So, I mean,
But, the rest of the world is close to us, too, these days.
no, but we hear a lot. I hear a lot of people talking about the damage to the United States and trust and the degradation. And I'm not trying to say you're wrong. I'm simply trying to say those are big words, and yet the U.S. is still the world's largest superpower. How is it that concretely we're seeing countries act differently as a consequence of what's happening?
I accept the challenge. Point number one, we're no longer a predictable partner. Point number two, we're getting out of agreements rather than fashioning.
But what are the implications of that?
And the implications of that we're no longer trusworthy.
So who's
And
doing
we no
what?
longer work in the benefit.
Who's doing what differently?
And the implication of that is that new people are struggling in an increasingly disheveled world to see if they can bring about some kind of more useful order. And we're seeing the growing up of an alternative to the liberal progressive order. And that alternative is very clearly dictatorial autocracy. And dictatorial autocracy is the perhaps fascination of a small group of leaders who aspire to it, but not necessarily something that greatly benefits very many players in very many countries around the world. And so if you're looking at perhaps your own interest as well as your national interest, is it good to have a disheveled world? Is it good to have increasing competition for power? Is it good to have an America where you can't turn and say, what's the United States going to do, even though that's the pattern and habit, particularly of our friends and allies, because they want to know where we're going, even if they don't follow it. That's seemingly now all disappearing. And after the Iraq invasion, particularly in the Middle East, U.S. popularity descended to very low figures. And it went down geometrically with a whiff of a whirlwind through the process. Rebuilding it, Obama and others took a linear process, a long time. Now it's gone down again. So how many roller coaster rides do people take around the world, believing the United States is the most trusted country in the world, perhaps one of the wisest, the most powerful in using its force for the public interest on a broad basis rather than a narrow promotion of an individual personality?
Do you think that's rebuildable?
Of course it is. But the longer it goes on, the longer the linear process of recovery is going to take, and the more work we're going to have to do. And having a problem of once burned, twice shy, you don't reconstruct that whole question in the blinking of an eye. And there will always be this view. The Americans at one time elected somebody who did all of these things that, at least I'm trying to explain to you, have not helped promote American leadership in the world. Can we ever trust the U.S. again to stay on track as we had trusted it in the period after the Second World War and through the Cold War?
If you were advising someone that just got out of college, is thinking about taking the exam, becoming a diplomat, what's something from your experience applied to the world today that you think they need to know?
I would say that as difficult as present times are, we will need you even more in the rebuilding.
Ambassador Tom Pickering.
Thank
you
you,
very
Ian.
much.
Great to be with you, my
Very
friend.
good.
Thanks, yeah.
That's our show this week. We'll be right back here next week, same place, same time, unless you're watching on social media, in which case it's wherever you happen to be. Don't miss it. In the meantime, check us out at GZEROmedia.com.
The GZERO World is brought to you by our founding sponsor, First Republic. First Republic, a private bank and wealth management company. Imagine a bank without teller lines, where your banker knows your name and its most prized currency is extraordinary client service. Hear directly from First Republic's clients by visiting firstrepublic.com.
You're listening to the GZERO World with Ian Bremmer podcast, your weekly geopolitical deep dive into the world's biggest news stories, featuring in-depth conversations with global leaders and newsmakers. To get more of GZERO's insights on global politics every morning, sign up for our free newsletter, GZERO Daily, at gzeromedia.com.